Picture this, a national park so full of life that scientists once called it one of the richest wildlife habitats on the entire continent of Africa. Then, for 15 straight years, it sat in the middle of a brutal civil war. Soldiers hid in it. Landmines littered it. Animals were slaughtered, not by accident, but on purpose. For meat, for ivory, for money to keep the fighting going. By the time the war finally ended, scientists flew over this same park expecting to see herds of elephants and buffalo. Instead, they saw almost nothing. Some estimates say over 90% of the large animals were simply gone. For a lot of people, that would have been the end of the story. Write it off, move on, let the jungle quietly swallow what was left. But one man looked at that same wasteland and saw something nobody else could. Not ruins, a blank canvas. What he chose to do next would take more than 2 decades, nearly all of his personal fortune, and a level of stubborn patience most people don't have. And somehow, against every reasonable expectation, it worked. Stick around, because what this park looks like today is going to surprise you. To understand how bad things got, you have to go back to the 1960s, when this place, Gorongosa National Park, in the African nation of Mozambique, was considered one of the greatest wildlife destinations on the entire continent. Tourists flew in from around the world just to see it. Lions everywhere, elephant herds numbering in the thousands. A landscape so rich that people compared it to the Serengeti. It was, by every account, paradise. Then, in 1977, everything fell apart. Mozambique had just won its independence, and almost immediately, a civil war broke out that would last for 15 years. And here's the part most people don't realize. Gorongosa wasn't just near the fighting, it became one of the central battlegrounds of the entire war. Armed groups used the dense bush as cover. The mountain at its center became a stronghold. And the animals that had made this place famous became something else entirely, a resource to exploit. Elephants were killed in the thousands, their ivory sold to fund weapons and soldiers. Other animals were hunted simply for food, because in a war zone, a herd of antelope is the difference between starving and surviving. Tens of thousands of wire snares and traps were laid across the park, many of them left behind even after the fighting stopped, still capable of maiming or killing any animal unlucky enough to wander into one. By 1992, when the war finally ended, scientists conducted an aerial survey of the park, expecting to get a sense of what remained. What they found was almost unimaginable. Somewhere between 90 and 99% of the park's large mammals were simply gone. Elephants that had once numbered in the thousands were down to a population you could count in the low hundreds. Lions, once one of the defining predators of the region, had been reduced to a small handful, and most of the ones that survived weren't even healthy. Several were missing legs, maimed by the very snares left scattered across the park. For years afterward, the most common living thing you'd encounter in Gorongosa wasn't an elephant or a lion. It was malaria-carrying mosquitoes swarming over land that used to be one of the most biodiverse places on Earth. Here's the twist that makes this story different from 100 other war-destroyed nature stories you've probably heard. Most places like this just stay broken. The infrastructure is gone, the funding is gone, the political will is gone, and usually that's where the story ends. A quiet, permanent loss, filed away as one more casualty of war that nobody outside the region ever really hears about. But in 2004, an American businessman named Greg Carr flew over Gorongosa for the first time. He wasn't a biologist. He wasn't a park ranger. He'd made his fortune building voicemail systems for telephone companies. And after selling his businesses, he'd spent years trying to figure out what to do with both his money and the rest of his life. Looking down from that plane, he didn't see a wasteland. He saw rivers still running, forests still standing, grasslands still stretching for miles. The bones of an ecosystem were still there. It just had almost nothing living in it anymore. And in that moment, looking at a park most people had already given up on, Greg Carr made a decision that would consume the next 2 decades of his life. The first thing Greg Carr did when he arrived wasn't release a single animal. It was something far less glamorous. He and his team spent months simply removing landmines and wire snares. eventually clearing more than 20,000 of them scattered across a park covering nearly 1 million acres. Think about that for a second. 20,000 traps, hidden in grass and brush, left over from a war that had ended over a decade earlier, still capable of crippling or killing anything that walked through. You couldn't bring a single new animal into that environment until you'd made it safe enough for one to survive. Once that groundwork was laid, Carr made a calculated decision that surprised a lot of conservationists watching from outside. He didn't start with the dramatic stuff, no lions, no elephants, not yet. He started with herbivores, buffalo, wildebeest, zebra, the unglamorous animals nobody puts on a postcard. Because here's something most people don't think about. You can't bring predators back into an ecosystem with nothing for them to eat. So piece by piece, his team trucked in herds of grazing animals from elsewhere in Africa, releasing them into a landscape that hadn't supported large wildlife in decades. And then, only once there was enough prey on the ground, did the predators come back. Lions that had been reduced to a handful of injured, snare-maimed survivors were given space and protection to recover and breed. African wild dogs, a species that had vanished from the park completely, were reintroduced from scratch. Slowly, an ecosystem that had been stripped down to almost nothing began rebuilding itself, layer by layer, exactly the way it would have assembled naturally, just compressed into years instead of millennia. This is where most comeback stories like to wrap up with a neat bow. This one doesn't. In 2013, just 5 years into the restoration project, fighting broke out again in the region surrounding Gorongosa. A new wave of instability swept through, threatening to undo years of careful, expensive, patient work. Then, in 2019, a massive cyclone tore through Mozambique, leveling around 100,000 homes in the surrounding communities. For anyone with less resolve, either one of those events could have been the moment to walk away and call it a loss. Carr didn't. He stayed. The team stayed. The animals that had only just begun to reestablish themselves kept being protected through both crises year after year, regardless of what was happening outside the park's borders. And here's the detail that genuinely changes how you should think about this entire project. Carr didn't just focus on wildlife. He made a bet that conservation could not succeed in isolation from the 250,000 people living around the park's edges, people among the poorest in the world. So alongside the animal reintroductions, his foundation built schools, trained teachers, gave away coffee trees to hundreds of farming families on the slopes of Mount Gorongosa, buying their beans above market price and helping reforest a mountain that had been stripped bare during the war. They created clubs specifically to keep young girls in school. They hired local people, including in some cases former soldiers and former poachers, and trained them as rangers to protect the very wildlife their predecessors had once hunted. Today, more than 1,600 people from those surrounding communities are directly employed because this park exists. The logic was simple, but radical for its time. You cannot protect a park surrounded by people with nothing to lose. Give them something to gain instead, and the entire equation changes. So, more than 2 decades after Greg Carr first looked down from that plane and saw a wasteland everyone else had given up on, what does Gorongosa actually look like today? Numbers tell part of the story, and they're staggering. Lions, once reduced to maybe 10 injured survivors, now number well over 200. Elephants, down to barely 200 after the war, have climbed past 800. Buffalo went from under 100 to nearly 2,000. Antelope populations that had collapsed to fewer than 1,000 individuals now number in the tens of thousands. African wild dogs, a species that had vanished from the park entirely, are back and thriving in packs of over 200. Altogether, the park's large mammal population has grown by roughly 7 times what it was just a decade into the restoration era, and it's still climbing. But numbers alone don't capture what's actually changed on the ground. Carr himself describes driving through the park in the early days when spotting a single baboon or warthog over an entire day was considered a good outing. Drive through that same park today, and within minutes you might pass a herd of elephants on one side of the road and a pride of lions resting in the shade on the other. 10,000 waterbuck graze across the floodplains. The diversity is so extraordinary that one of the most respected biologists of the last century, after visiting multiple times, called Gorongosa one of the most biologically rich parks anywhere on the planet, a claim almost nobody would have dared make about this same stretch of land 30 years earlier. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you, though. This isn't a finished success story sitting comfortably in the past. As recently as the past couple of years, teams have still been using drones to track reintroduced animals, still bringing in new zebra and antelope to balance grazing pressure, still monitoring water systems and forest regrowth across a park spanning 1,500 square miles of floodplains, savanna, and mountain slopes. Some species are thriving so well they've outpaced every projection. Others are still climbing back from near zero, decades after the war that nearly erased them. Restoration on this scale was never going to be a single moment of triumph. It's an ongoing generational project, and the people working on it know that better than anyone. What makes this story worth remembering isn't just that elephants came back or that lions stopped limping on 3 legs from old snare wounds. It's the proof underneath all of it that even a landscape stripped down to almost nothing, declared by most outside observers to be beyond saving, can come roaring back to life if enough people refuse to walk away from it. A park that once held nothing but mosquitoes and buried landmines is now one of the richest wildlife habitats left on Earth. If a story like that doesn't restore a little bit of your faith in what's possible, it's hard to know what would. If you want more stories like this, places everyone wrote off, and the people who refuse to accept that, let me know in the comments and hit subscribe for more.